Record. Dawn, it's all you.
All right, thanks very much everyone for attending today. So we're going to be just kind of reviewing invasive pests and how we can protect our urban trees from it. So we're going to have an urban focus, and of course going to be a tree pest focus. And if you didn't notice by the Northwestern Regional Technical Manager title, it's going to be kind of west-based. So not that I'm excluding you Easterners, even though you send us most of your pests. I'm kidding. It is going to be somewhat from that perspective. So like I said, my name's Dawn Fluharty. This is my first time ever using my bio slide that Kara was nice enough to make for me. Lots of information about me, and we don't really need to spend any time about it. But just know that I mainly work on the West Coast, and I work with all the various organizations out here. So I have my degree in environmental horticultural sciences with a minor in soil science, and I'm going to be talking about what's an invasive. So when we start talking about invasive pests, there's always this argument of what's truly an invasive and what's not really an invasive. And I'd go with the broadest definition possible. If it's an organism that's kind of been introduced into an area that's not its native or natural area, it's an invasive. So do I say an invasive is something that's come in to the United States? Yes, that's invasive. But also I define it as a pest that may have come in from Arizona and moved into California. That's also invasive. So when we're looking at this, we just kind of take it from the broadest term of an invasive pest. And when we talk about invasives, there's invasive pests, there's invasive diseases, there's invasive plants. So this talk today is going to be focusing on pests and diseases though. So I always joke about this one, and I can't help start it on a bit of a light note. But it was one of those situations where a tree pest, an invasive tree pest, this happened to be a Toro lawnmower, which of course is not made in the United States, so therefore it's an invasive pest. Because I can't tell you how many times lawnmowers or edgers are doing damage to our trees. And as you can see, it's the same thing with the roots when they drive over the roots. It's one of those things, it's just kind of getting people to think outside the box and realize that, yes, we're focused on tree pests and diseases, but there are other pests that unfortunately torture our trees on a regular basis. And lawnmowers have to be the number one who actually do this. So if we can, always try and keep the grass away from the tree. Keep the grass all the way out of the drip line of the tree if you can. It helps the health of the tree. It stops the competition of the grass with the roots. And it's just an overall environment much better suited for trees. The other pest I can talk about are the other pests of our poor urban canopy trees. Yeah, cars. I think I got a Toyota and a Honda in these photos. I couldn't help it. I was really going for that invasive foreign pest. But the whole thing, it's another one of those scenarios where these trees have so many different problems, and this is just another one that they have on a daily basis of people, you know, of course, running into them, doing damage. And these are sort of some of the things that we don't always think of or realize when we're dealing with trees. And so this is another one of those tree stressors. So another one of those issues where people don't believe it when I say that the tree will almost always win. I've never seen one where the car tends to win. So it really behooves people to be aware of it and then know that this really affects our trees. They're great tree stressors, and it makes it difficult for tree injection applications later on. So, okay, so let's actually get into invasive pests. So I start with this one, the glassy winged sharpshooter, because, oh gosh, 10 years ago now, there wasn't a single person in California who didn't know the horrible threats of the glassy winged sharpshooter. It was going to completely wipe out our wine industry. Nobody was going to be drinking wine in 10 years. I mean, that's literally how drastic it was kind of sold to the industry at that time. And essentially what it was is this particular pest was vectoring Pearson's disease, which, you know, would get into the grapevines and basically kill them off. And so therefore, everybody was on the watch out for this pest. And so we had tons of quarantines in place for this particular pest. If somebody shipped plant material from one end of the state to another, they had to inspect it before it left, and they had to inspect it when it landed. And this is one of those things that is actually really good practices when we're dealing with invasive pests. Not all invasives get quarantines, and that's based on what level of invasive pest you're dealing with. So in the case of the glassy wing sharpshooter, it was a class A. Everything was quarantined, everything was tracked, everything was monitored, and they had a mitigation program in place. So as you can see, you know, 10, 20 years later, we still have plenty of wine in California, don't you worry. Granted, COVID-19 shelter in place is taking a good dip out of that wine. But in the meantime, it was one of those things, people were so well aware of this pest that it actually did really help stop the transmission of the disease. So therefore, it was very successful in the campaign that they did with this. Do we still have glassy wing sharpshooter out? Yes. Do we still have Pearson's disease? Yes. Do we have some grapevines up in Napa with it? Yes. But it did not turn into the massive issue that it was suspected to. So that kind of gets us into how bad are invasive species? Well, it really kind of depends on the pest itself. And unfortunately, right now, there are so many different pests out there. As you can see, we have over 576 invasive pests in the US currently, but there are plenty more who could easily make their way here. And don't get me wrong, I say that they're always making their way here. We do our fair share of shipping pests out to other countries as well. So this is definitely a worldwide issue, and every country has its own battle against it. So for us here in the States, we try to be as proactive as possible about stopping pests from coming in at the borders, whether it's our ports, airports. Has anyone ever heard of the Beagle Brigade? It's one of our defenses against invasive pests that are in the airports. And basically these beagles go around to luggage and sniff out different fruits or meats that shouldn't be coming into our country. And so that's one way of stopping these pests from getting in. If you want to know about the species that we currently have in the US, you can see I put the website down there. That's one of the best resources for getting the invasive pest information. So what makes them so dangerous for us? And honestly, the main reason is we don't have any natural controls when they come into a new area. There's no beneficial pests that are going to attack them and wipe them out. And so usually the first step that happens when we get an invasive pest into a new area, we go back to the old area and try and find that beneficial pest and then introduce it into the new area where this pest is spread to. That is not always exactly quick. Sometimes it can take 10 years, and in some cases, 10 years later, we're still searching for the beneficial pest. So unfortunately, that is one of the more difficult reasons that it's hard to control some of these pests. And the other thing is it's always that unknown, that we know what tree it attacked from, its indigenous country, and all of a sudden it gets introduced to a new area, and there's a whole new host of trees, and the question is going to be, well, which trees is it going to attack? And so that's kind of one of those fun scenarios. And so that's why we do a lot of testing on it. So I kind of had a question out of my last class that I'd done about emerald ash borer. Well, the UC system here had tested to see if the ash borer would attack any of our agricultural commodity crops out here, such as almonds or olives or walnuts or pistachios. And sure enough, they had found out that the pest would attack the olives. So it's one of those things we're always constantly testing to see which trees it will attack, but you never really know until it gets here. So you're kind of always playing catch up and trying to identify where the issue is going to be. So these are some of the ones we currently have out west that we're dealing with for invasive pests and diseases. This is actually quite a short list, as you can tell, considering I got 576 in the country. These are kind of the main focus ones that we're dealing with out here in the West. And so there's some on here that people would never consider an invasive pest. And some of them, they've been around for so long, we just accept them as natural. And at this point, we just deal with them on a daily basis. So that definitely is where anthracnose falls in at this point, because you can't find a sycamore tree around here that doesn't have it. So just one of those things. There's different levels of invasives, and we're kind of talk about that in some of the pests what we review today. So the other thing I want to kind of define, and I kind of do this at the beginning of the talks, especially if I'm going to be talking about how we treat for pests. And a lot of time, I kind of define how we here describe integrated pest management. And I kind of do it as a three-step approach. First step is always kind of go out and assess what you can do to change the environment or change your cultural practices to get rid of the pest. And sometimes it can be as simple as removing that type of tree and planting a resistant type of tree. Or for instance, with bark beetles, you can water the tree and help mitigate some of the pests attacking. Unfortunately, that doesn't work with all pests, and it really doesn't work with invasives usually. So we're always moving on to step 2 and step 3 when dealing with invasive pests. So the trick is you always have to monitor in step 2 and identify if it's truly a problem we really need treating for, and then kind of establish what they call, the guidelines of treatment. And they want you to find the chemical that is most specific that will target that specific pest. And that's difficult, honestly, because most chemicals we use out in the industry are not single pest focused. Most of our chemicals we look to be broad spectrum, meaning having a wide array of pests on the label. So we don't really get that targeted goal like they're kind of trying to get in step 2. And basically step 3 of IPM is, yes, identifying, what your pest is and what chemical best and most appropriately treats that pest, and then applying it in a manner that minimizes the risks, basically human health, your beneficials, the non-targets, and of course the environment. So that's where we normally land when we're dealing with invasive pests. We usually land in step 3 because we know we're having to use a chemical control against this pest where we don't have natural predators in place. So we kind of look at the different treatment methodologies and identify which one best falls into the IPM program. So when we come to treating trees, still the #1 way we treat a tree pest or disease is removal. It's sad, but it's true. We have so many options out there nowadays, but honestly, everybody's got a chainsaw. So that is a very easy approach, and you don't have to have a license to do it. So that is still our biggest uphill battle, especially if it's something as simple as aphids. They're still probably the #1 most treated for pest, but it's just because they're a nuisance pest. They cause that honeydew, and so therefore you get that sticky, icky mess. Customers complain. People say, okay, we got to do something about it. Customers like, okay, do whatever you need, and still removal tends to be the first step. But there's many other options. Like for instance, we see soil dredge in the upper right-hand corner. We see bark spray in the upper left-hand corner. We got foliar spray there in the middle. And then of course we have the myriad of injection systems down below. So there's lots of different options for treating trees. So when we start looking at which is the best one to be using for going after invasives, it really depends on the pest. So let's take a look at some of the invasive pests that we're dealing with in this area. And so I always start with my eucalyptus trees. I'm still trying to convince people they're worth saving. It's hard because when we start talking about invasives, the first thing people tend to say is, well, the eucalyptus tree is an invasive. Yes, it is. It's not native to California. It's not native to the West. It's native to Australia. And unfortunately, it's been here so long that it's one of those situations where we've kind of naturalized it into our urban environment. So at this point, eucalyptus trees make up almost 20% of our urban canopy. So if we decided just to get rid of all of our invasives, we'd lose a significant percentage of our canopy. So the nice part is, though, it's easy to identify the pests that attack eucalyptus trees as being invasive because they all pretty much came from Australia as well, usually over on the imported trees. But we don't have too many, but we do have kind of 4 top offenders at this point in time. So the one that's probably most known throughout the state is the actual Lerp psyllid. And that's the one that causes those sticky masses on the leaves. So they're the sucking piercing pest. And it's usually that sticky, icky mess that everyone complains about is the main issue. The other pest that we have now attacking, which is also a sucking piercing pest, is the bronzing bug. And this one is also sucking piercing, and it's mainly in Southern California at this point. But it has this rasping effect where you can see the discoloration on the leaves. And again, stresses the tree, but not really a tree killer. Then we get into our tortoise beetle, which this one is a little bit more of a tree stressor. And here's the reason, is because this beetle actually chews notches out of the leaf. And once that beetle's taken so many notches out of that leaf, the tree aborts the leaf. So now it's causing the tree to defoliate, which is a distinct stressor on the trees. And the other fun kind of side effect to this is, as a tree aborts leaves, it naturally wants to push new growth, right? Well, that Lerp psyllid loves the new growth. So now all of a sudden we get more Lerp psyllid infestations. So it's a very quick downward spiral on these poor trees once they start getting stressed and pests coming in. And then kind of the last nail in the coffin to a eucalyptus tree is that Eucalyptus longhorn borer. So usually once the tree is pretty stressed with the other pests, this longhorn borer comes in, and he's usually the final one who kind of pushes the tree over the edge and can actually kill the tree. So usually once we're taking down dead eucalyptus trees, we see tons of galleries from this longhorn borer. The nice part about these pests is they're actually pretty easy to treat. Imidacloprid will treat all 4 of these pests. So we tend to say do an application of imidacloprid. I tend to recommend fall. Some people like to try and do it in spring. I tend to avoid spring because imidacloprid has that B box label on the label. And unfortunately, it means you can't apply when the tree is in flower. Eucalyptus trees tend to flower in spring. So therefore, I try and say, avoid the applications in spring. Go ahead, do them in the fall. That way there's not gonna be flowers, you're not gonna have that issue, and that tree is gonna be protected for 1 year. So you can do this application on these type trees. You're definitely not gonna try that foliar spray. Most of these trees are 80 and 90 foot tall at this point. So we tend to say, do the soil drench or do the trunk injection of imidacloprid. Bark banding is not successful, so you definitely want to go with either trunk injection or soil drench. All right, so bronze birch borer. This guy, he's kind of somewhat new to us down here in California, and now from what I hear into Nevada as well. Bronze birch borer kind of started up in the Pacific Northwest. It was kind of related to the two-line chestnut borer. Everyone thought it was very similar initially. However, birch borers will attack all types of birch trees, and it tries to stay with birch trees. We don't see it varying from birch trees too terribly much, but it is a flathead borer. So as you can see over on the right-hand side, we get that D-shaped exit hole. When it exits, it's flat on one side, round on the other. And that is one of the telltale signs for identifying this particular beetle. We didn't really notice it come into California because it came in during our drought. A lot of our birch trees love water. Of course, no drought. In a drought, we don't have the water. The trees were dying. People assumed it was from drought. Started looking closer and we started finding all the galleries underneath the bark, started seeing those D-shaped exit holes. And we immediately knew what was going on. So this one's a little bit trickier to treat in the fact that you can use both imidacloprid and emamectin benzoate against this pest. Usually if you're doing a preventative situation where you don't really have the pest in the area, you tend to want to go with the soil drench of the imidacloprid. It's just kind of a preventative, protecting the trees, especially going into another drought. They're going to be stressed, so there's a really good chance this pest is going to flare up again. So preventative soil drench of the imidacloprid works well. If you already have a pest in a tree and maybe you've had a branch die out from it, then you definitely want to move up to the actual trunk injection of imidacloprid. Get that concentration in the tree higher and make sure it distributes through the tree faster than what it would with soil drench. If you've already had a tree kind of die out, or you start to get an attack to the main trunk, you pretty much have to move up to the emamectin benzoate at that point to really be effective against this pest. The nice part is the emamectin benzoate lasts 2 years in the tree, so you don't have to do it as often. But it is one of those scenarios where you kind of have a stepped process to treating for this particular pest. And I had a couple people say to me that they'd been trying to use the azosol or the azadirachtin product against it. I really don't recommend it. The control is not as good as imidacloprid or emamectin benzoate, and the timing is much more difficult for the treatment. It's much easier to miss that timing window for it because it's a narrower residual in the tree. So keep that in mind, particularly when working with this one, and we'll have to be aware of this pest because, like I said, it will attack any type of birch tree, including river birch. Oh, and by the way, we forgot to mention at the beginning, if you guys have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free, enter them into your little chat bar down there. It'll pop up onto the side, and then at the end, we'll go through any questions you might have. So if there's any clarification you have on pests or treatments, please don't hesitate to ask. Okay, so Thousand Cankers disease. This is another one that only pretty much gets into our black walnuts. There has been testing that shows it'll go into other walnut varieties. But black walnut seems to be a preferred tree, and it is definitely deadly for the tree. Fairly quickly deadly, actually. Usually we'll hear that someone's got like a dead branch in the top, and then the next thing they know, the whole top third of the tree is not looking great, and then within about 6 months or so, the whole tree is starting to die out. And what it is we have these tiny little beetles vectoring a disease called Geosmithia morbida. And what ends up happening is every time this twig beetle bores in, it vectors in the disease and it causes this fungal infection. Well, unfortunately, the infection is quite virulent. And so not only is there damage from the beetle itself boring into the tree, but the actual cankers are also affecting the tree. So this can actually kill a tree pretty quickly. So there's some telltale signs you can kind of look for. You can tell just by the death by the branch, the starting to discoloration out of the top of the tree. And then you'll also see the tiny little boreholes from the beetle itself. So be on the lookout. It's one of those things, like I said, it tends to want to go to the black walnuts, but it does have the potential to go into other walnut varieties. So we are paying attention to that one very closely. And UC Davis is, I think, still currently working with research on this one. Dr. Don Grossman has been working with research with them on this one. So if you're looking for more detail on this one in particular, by all means, reach out. There's lots of research being done with this particular pest. But right now, we tend to use the emamectin benzoate product against the beetle itself. And we've done some tests with the propazole or proconazole on the actual fungal infection. However, black walnuts seem to be a little bit sensitive to the proconazole product. So I tend to recommend fall applications. So if you do get some sort of marginal leaf burn, they just drop off in the fall, and when they releaf in spring, they look nice. So one of those little tips and tricks. All right, Dutch elm disease. This is another one of those kind of pest disease complex situations. And Dutch elm disease is something that we all know it across the country. We've all had some experience with this particular pest. And a lot of us have kind of put it on the back burner, kind of forgot about it. Well, for some reason here on the West, it seems to be making a bit of a resurgence. In the last few years, we've seen it show up in Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, Sacramento, California, San Jose, California. Now it's down in San Diego. So it's kind of interesting how it's kind of just come straight down the coast on the West. But it's definitely making a resurgence. And what people tend to call first about, because they're not familiar, they don't remember this disease, it's kind of, like I said, falling off our radar, is people come up and say, hey, you know, I think I have a fire blight in my elm tree. And it's just because it gets that dead branch, that one lone kind of dead branch first. And that's the disease starting to show up. The disease can be vectored by a myriad of beetles, but it can also be vectored by root grafts. So if you happen to have a bunch of elms planted next to each other down an elm-lined street or in a park, those elm trees will graft their roots together, and they can actually share the fungal infection. So that's one of the differences with this particular disease. Is the fact that the trees can share it very easily through their root system. There's not too many other that actually do that. So when we talk about treating for this one, by all means, you can work on trying to kill the vectors, the beetles. You can do that with the emamectin benzoate. And then if you're going after the fungal infection itself, you need to be using the propiconazole. It's nice because it's a micro injection. And again, it is an actual trunk injection, but it's not the old 55-gallon macro injection of like Arborjet that we used to do back in the day. So this is actually pretty quick and easy to do, and it lasts about 2 years. So you're coming back every couple of years to treat and suppress the disease. But it's that disease that's kind of the key. That's really what can kill off the tree in this. It's not so much the pests, the bacterium beetles. Like I said, they're more of a vector problem than they are an actual tree killing issue. But you can see in the photos how you get those dead branches, the leaves hang on it, they kind of get that hook to it. So I can see where people confuse it with fire blight, but we don't get fire blight in our elm trees, so it's definitely the Dutch elm disease. And then if you cut those branches, you can see the fungal infection down there actually in the branch, and that's what's girdling and killing that branch. And that's what will happen throughout the whole tree. And then if you look at the trunk of the tree, sometimes you actually find those bore holes from the vectoring beetles. Usually if you have a standalone tree and you have Dutch elm disease in the area, you would definitely want to do the insecticide and the fungicide. If it's one of those scenarios where you already have a bunch of trees in a park, well, odds are they're going to be passed by root grafts, so you might want to focus on the fungal suppression more than the vectoring beetle suppression. All right, Western Oak Bark Beetle. So I have this guy here, and if honestly, if any of you guys are in California, you're looking at me going, the Western Oak Bark Beetle, but that's a native to California. And yes, it is. So this is not an invasive pest. It's something we always have in California. And usually when we get into drought symptoms, this little pest flares up and we see a lot more of his attacks. But the problem is he, being native, picked up a non-native disease called Foamy Bark Canker Disease, another Geosmithia infection. And so where he would normally bore into a tree and just leave a little frass, now we get this weeping, bleeding effect from the disease being introduced into the tree. And so usually we don't worry about treating for this pest. The actual beetle itself, it's native. The native trees are pretty used to them. But now that they're bringing in this disease, that's the real issue. This disease actually gets into that vascular tissue and girdles very quickly that vascular tissue inside the tree and causes it to die. So if it's in one of our multi-branching oaks, you can always cut out the infected branch and just treat and protect the other 2 branches. But sometimes it'll go into an entire tree and do significant damage. The biggest problem we have with this pest is it doesn't seem just to go from tree to tree to tree to tree. It seems to hit a few trees in an area and then go half a mile down the road, skip all the trees in the middle, and then start attacking again. So its attack pattern is a little bit unusual, and it's not even just going for the most stressed trees. So it makes it hard to do preventative treatments because we don't know where it's going to land. But it's one of those situations, if you're doing preventative, you would just do the insecticide. You probably would not need to do the fungicide. But if you actually have a tree that's infested, there's actually hit sites, you have that weeping and that bleeding, you definitely want to go with the insecticide and the fungicides. The ones we've been doing successfully has been the emamectin benzoate and the propiconazole. Where we have some more tests looking to come up as soon as we can find some good research sites. It's hard to research this pest because, like I said, it wants to spread out. It doesn't want to give us a good attack site with 30 trees to research. So that's been a bit of a challenge. The other issue is it doesn't just attack our coast live oaks. It gets into our valley oaks, black oaks, red oaks. Unfortunately, the red oaks, when this pest attacks the red oaks, instead of getting like individual kind of weeping, bleeding sites, the whole trunk of the tree looks like you just hose it down and it's just wet. We have yet to see a red oak that was under attack that actually survived. It's the virulent, the Foamy Bark Canker Disease, the Geosmithia, seems to be very virulent in red oaks. So that's a difficult one. So if you do happen to have a red oak in an area where this Western Oak Bark Beetle vectoring the Foamy Bark Canker is, I would definitely recommend doing preventative treatments, especially on the red oaks, just in case, because they do succumb so quickly. And then sudden oak death. So sudden oak death out here is one of those pests that I don't want to say it's like a black eye in a way for us, but it was interesting. Some European research came out showing that we could have controlled sudden oak death had we been more proactive, but we would have had to have done it back in 2003. So we might have missed that by 17 years. Unfortunately, there was always great research with this particular disease, but we never did a lot of actual treatments out here in California and made a program for it because it was mainly out in our rangelands. It didn't really get into our urban canopy too much. And so unfortunately, it was allowed to take hold in our more native environments and pretty much run rampant. It's now moved up into Oregon. And will most likely spread all the way down to Southern California as well. So with this one in particular, it's pretty easy to identify. There are a lot of different Phytophthora species out there, but this one specific Phytophthora ramorum is the sudden oak death. And usually you'll see some sort of infection or cracking or bleeding in the bottom like 3 feet of the trees where we tend to see the big main cankers show up. But sometimes you never even see the cankers. All you see is these leaves that start dying, and they kind of look like they're watermarked almost, like the leaf has kind of faded. So it doesn't look like it goes brown like a fungal infection. It's kind of interesting the way they kind of die back. And then of course you get that thin reduced canopy very quickly. So with that being said, whenever we're dealing with sudden oak death, urgency is the #1 thing. If we can actually get the trees protected, you can usually save the trees. If the trees are already infected with the disease, they're very hard to save. I think the last study out of UC Berkeley said even with trunk injection, you only had a 25% chance of saving the tree when you treated it. So that tells us immediately right there, prevention is the key to this particular one. So if you do happen to find an infected tree, you definitely want to treat all surrounding trees and protect them. So there's a couple different methodologies we use. The younger trees with a thinner bark, so anything usually 12 inches in diameter and smaller, we'll just do a bark spray of phosphorus on there. And that's an every year application. And it works well. But once you get into the larger diameter trees with a thicker bark, and yeah, sometimes there's moss and lichen covering the bark sprays are just not nearly as effective. So that's when we move to trunk injection of the phosphorus product. And so we do the trunk injection. It lasts for 2 years. So you're not injected every year. It's every couple years. And it's one of those things, it's great for suppressing the disease and allowing it to take hold. We try and do those applications during the rainy season because a lot of our oaks out here in California like to go dormant during the summer. So we don't really want to be drilling into them and trying to get them to uptake product. That's not the time when they want to be doing that. So we tend to say usually after our rain starts, so usually October, first couple weeks of October, we'll start our treatments in oak trees, and then we'll usually take it through the end of March. So that's kind of our window, kind of October through March is when we want to be treating our trees, our oak trees. And that way they have natural rainfall. If you are working out in a rangeland, that helps that product move up through the tree and disperse. But the thing about a sudden oak death is it is vectored incredibly easily. It is not a beetle that's going to vector this. They have these oomyces that get on everything. There was a study done out of the Santa Cruz Mountains that was just kind of mind-boggling in the fact that they were in there removing some trees that had died from the infection, and then they cleaned the trucks, they cleaned everything to the point where they thought that they had it perfectly cleaned, drove it off site, and then they went through and part of the study, they tested everything. They tested tires, wheel wells, shoes, steering wheels, cell phones, and they literally found the infection on every piece they tested, cell phones, shoes, cars, everything. So as you can see, it vectors incredibly easily. So we really try not to spread it off site. So sometimes I get people calling and wondering, you know, they'll drive the coast and they'll see all these dead tan oaks who are extremely susceptible to it. And they're like, why don't they remove them? Well, it's partly money, funding. Funding's always huge, right? But also they spread a lot of infection just by removing those trees. So they're kind of on that double-edged sword. So yes, there's a lot of dead trees on the coast of California from sudden oak death. All right, the IPS Engraver Beetle. So this is kind of a hard one. Yes, it's invasive. Some are native. We have a lot. I think there's over 300 species of IPS Engraver Beetles. And it depends on where you are as to if it's invasive or not. But one of the most destructive ones we have is what we call the California five-spined IPS Engraver Beetle. So you would think it's from California, right? Well, no, we like to keep everyone guessing. So the reason why I talk about the engraver beetle is because it is one of those beetles that we do find throughout kind of our canopies in the urban forest. And so usually we'll note it by the fact that you'll notice a dead branch or two up in a tree. Sometimes you'll see the top third of a tree die out. That one we refer to as the tip ip because it tends to kill the tip of the tree. The thing about these beetles, they're quite a bit smaller than our standard bark beetles we associate with conifers. But it's the same idea where moisture really helps alleviate the stress of the tree. So it alleviates that attractant of this particular pest to the tree. The easier part about these pests is they're easier to treat for. And it's mainly for the fact that they don't disrupt as much of the vascular tissue all at once in a tree. So if we are doing an injection of amomectin benzoate, it can spread throughout the tree and protect the tree. If you happen to be lucky and get one of those tip ips where it's killed the top third of your tree and you inject your tree, you know, the chemical's only going to go up where the vascular tissue is still valid and viable. But you can usually save the tree. You have to prune out that dead top, but you can train a new leader and maintain the tree. But it's one of those things. The engraver beetles are one of those beetles that, like I said, always tend to be in our canopies somewhere. Whether they're at destructive levels is another story. Anytime we get into drought conditions, their populations swell. And so with us being in this mega drought on the west, it's one of those situations we're probably going to see beetle infestations for quite some time to come. And with California being on a drought index right now in Northern California, we're definitely going to see more beetle issues throughout this year. So watering if we can. If you can get that first step in your IPM program and water, by all means. If not, bark sprays are really difficult on this one just for the fact of where the pests attack. So we tend to go trunk injection for this particular methodology, and we go with the amomectin benzoate. Pitch canker. So pitch canker is one of those infections. It's actually Fusarium that kind of started out in kind of the Monterey area. So we would like to call it a native, but it is not. It was introduced. It kind of got into the Monterey pine stand out there. And since that was the only real natural Monterey pine stand in California, we didn't think there'd be a whole lot of spread of this particular disease. problem was nursery industry found out that Monterey pines were pretty quick growing pine trees and they could propagate them really easily. So the next thing we knew, we had tons of pine trees being sold in the nursery industry and shipped throughout California. And so now we have pitch canker disease throughout California. And we kind of thought it might stay more on the coastal areas because we've seen it spread by, you know, kind of rain and wind and moisture, as well as the vectoring beetles. But we have this all the way out in, you know, not Las Vegas, Palm Desert, Palm Springs. So clearly not a lot of wind and rain out there for this to succeed. But it is one of those particular diseases that it will kill the tree over time. We can suppress the disease by treating it with the propiconazole product. But the thing is once you get an area that's already so infested with this particular disease, you have to also go after the vector. So like I said, there's a myriad of engraver beetles, twig beetles, and cone beetles that are all vectoring this particular disease. So you have to start treating for the beetles as well. It's one of those things, we see pretty good reduction in infections that have already occurred, but preventative is really your best course of action. You really don't want this disease to take hold in the tree. It's always an uphill battle trying to suppress the disease already existing in a tree. So that being said, we try and do these applications in fall. Sometimes we'll do them in early spring, and partly because you're doing an insecticide and a fungicide application. Usually doing the insecticide to get at the vectoring beetles, and you're doing the fungicide against the disease itself. And so we tend to say do it in the fall, so it gives the chemical plenty of time to circulate throughout the tree before the beetles and vectors start flying the following spring. And it gives it that time to suppress the disease while it's being most likely vectored during our colder, rainier months when we're kind of windy and rainy. So with that one, it's hard to miss because you'll look at a tree and you'll see this massive like pitch and you think there's got to be an injury or some sort of pruning wound going on. And it's really actually just this pitch canker disease. So if you can't see an actual wound on the tree, look a little bit closer. You might actually have pitch canker. You'll also see the flagging of the tips, which is very indicative of this particular disease. And it's a great indicator as well. But usually I get the call when someone sees their whole trunk of their tree kind of covered in sap, and sometimes their first thought is, I have a massive bark beetle infestation. And well, you probably do have some bark beetles, but it's mainly the pitch canker causing that effect. So yes, so that's kind of what we recommend with dealing with this invasive. So Asian citrus psyllid, I talk about this one because right now it's our glassy winged sharpshooter of kind of the decade sort of thing. The Asian citrus psyllid, as you know, will attack our citrus crops. And though it's a psyllid and it's a sucking piercing pest and it can damage the plant material and basically suck the life out of the plants, the bigger issue we have with this particular pest is that it actually vectors a disease. And it's the disease that's most virulent for the plant material. And we've seen trees actually survive with both the pest and the disease, but the problem is that the fruit that's being produced no longer has the high sugar index. They're no longer a really good viable fruit. They tend to be mealy, having a thick skin, and not something that's sellable in our ag industry. So this is one of those pests that, because we are such a high citrus producer in California, we really pay attention to. And the other thing we tend to realize is just about everybody in California has some sort of citrus tree planted in their backyard. So we have lots and lots of vector sources and host tree problems just in the community surrounding our ag industry. And so far, that is where the actual green disease, the Hunglung-Bing disease, has actually been found so far, is mainly on people's individual properties in their backyard trees. So as of right now, those trees are ripped out and destroyed. They don't have a whole lot of documentation of it actually getting into the ag industry yet, but it really is a matter of time on this one, unfortunately. So there's lots of different control methodologies for the psyllid itself. We've had people using mainly imidacloprid applications via soil drench for this particular pest. We've had people doing azadirachtin sprays against it. So there's a lot of different ways to actually mitigate the pest. It's not exactly a difficult pest to get rid of. And what makes this one particular psyllid so unique from any other psyllid is it really does like to lift its hind end in the air, as you kind of see in the photos. It doesn't lay it on the branch, it kind of keeps it sticking up off the branch. So it makes it very unique and very easy to identify. And then you can see there's a profuse amount of kind of honeydew that it actually produces. But it's the greening disease that's the real issue that we all look for. So if we identify that there are psyllids in an area, we're automatically looking for the disease itself. And it's kind of easy to identify. You'll start seeing mottling on the leaves themselves, random kind of yellowing of the leaves. When you actually look at the fruit, you'll see they're usually smaller, a little bit more deformed. They kind of got this mealy inside. And unfortunately, when you actually taste the fruit itself, they're quite bitter. So that's the biggest issue about this particular disease. So as of right now, there is no way to cure this bacterial infection. They have been looking at different types of treatments. We've had some success with prolonging the life of trees with high micronutrient doses and nitrogen. But the problem is we don't want to keep those trees around because they're a vector. So we're just going to allow that disease to spread further. So as of right now, we're really not talking about trying to save any of the trees that have the disease. We're 100% advocating rip those trees out. In Florida, they have this as well. We're going to let Florida do all that research and testing since they already have it pretty much spread throughout their state. And we're trying to destroy and get rid of any traces where this actually shows up. So if you do happen to see any sort of kind of that yellow mottling, that deformed bitter fruit, please, 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 by all means, report it, let somebody know. It's honestly the on-the-ground arborists who are going into people's backyards and pruning other trees or working on the property, the landscapers who are gonna notice this first. And it really, really does behoove the whole industry is if you can report that and say, hey, there's a tree here I think is suspicious. It's your county ag who's the one who's wanting to have this reported. They have the authority to go in and check. So by all means, do let somebody know if you see a tree that has these kind of blotchy looking leaves. That's kind of one of the first indicators you'll notice. And you'll get the twig dieback as well. So it'll be an overall unhealthy looking tree. So that's what we're kind of recommending with this one at this point. Treat for the psyllid. By all means, remove it if you have any indication that it might have the greening disease. And while we're talking about psyllids, I thought I'd talk about the olive psyllid because this is one of those underlier psyllids that nobody really talks about. It's an invasive that came in back in 2007, so it hasn't been here too terribly long, and it was really overlooked. Everyone started noticing the sooty mold because they do produce honeydew, right? So also you look at these leaves, you're seeing all this sooty mold all over it. You're like, what is causing this? Well, if you look at that pest photo on the upper right-hand corner, you can see how they easily missed this psyllid. I mean, it lays down flat on the branch and it blends right in. It is very easily overlooked. And it has the ability that as soon as you maybe thought you glimpsed something, it flies away. So that was kind of the trick at first of identifying this particular pest. But with that being said, people were kind of blaming it on just about everything else from aphids to mealybugs to scale. And then we finally really discovered that it was this new olive psyllid that we were dealing with. So right now it's pretty much in Southern California. It hasn't made it up to Northern California. I think it just now ended up in Kern County. So it's working its way up north. In particular, this one, most of our imidacloprid products, any of our treatments for sucking piercing pests work very well against this one. The trick with this one is identifying it because like I said, it's very easily overlooked, easily missed, and it will basically suck the life out of the tree. It's a very, very successful feeder. So therefore it can really decline the overall health of the tree and allow other infections to get in as well. And if you're actually producing fruit, which I know most people are trying not to with their olives, but it will also deform the fruit as well. And so if you're looking to harvest, it will actually hurt the fruit as well. So kind of keep that in mind with this one. Oh, so treatment for this one, again, you want to avoid the flowering. So we tend to see late spring flowering with our olives. So you don't want to be really doing spring treatments of your imidacloprid or what have you after this particular pest. Any of your neonic products you're going to be using against it, you're going to want to do this one in the fall. And soil drenches work well for it. I don't really recommend bark sprays on olives. And trunk injection is not the easiest methodology on olives either. So if you can, do your soil drench. If not, fall back on trunk injection. Okay, this is a fun one. So how many of you guys have actually, well, granted, I forget that I'm not just talking to Californians here. So there's probably a lot of people out there who's heard about Bob. Bob is new to California. And when I talk about Bob, I'm talking about bur oak blight. We did not have a whole lot of bur oaks in California. So therefore, we never had to worry about bur oak blight. But then we realized that the bur oak had a very nice kind of upright growth habit, which was ideal for street trees. And since we're getting rid of all of our street trees, like pears that have fire blight and everything else and all their different infections, we thought we would go to the oak tree. Well, so we started importing a bunch of bur oaks from the Midwest, and funny, they showed up with bur oak blight. So now we're trying to get everyone to identify, yes, this is a new tree, and it possibly comes with a disease. And the problem with this tree, it's already a bit of an anomaly for us here in California, because when it goes dormant in the winter, the leaves all turn brown, the tree looks dead, and it doesn't drop the leaves. That's something we're not used to. It's not something we tend to be looking for. So when we think and we see it, we're like, wow, there's something wrong with that tree, which it just happens to be its normal growth habit. So people don't tend to realize what's going on. With bur oak blight, that overall canopy dieback and death happens even sooner. It happens in the warmer, more towards the summer months. So people have to kind of be aware of what to look for. The nice part about it, it's actually fairly easy to identify. You'll usually see the actual spores on the petioles of the leaves. So if you do happen to see what we think looks like a dead bur oak tree, go ahead and look at the petiole of the leaf, and you'll notice the spores on there. So you can actually see them. And that's a good quick indicator of what might be going on, since we're not terribly familiar with the growth habits of bur oak blights here in California. But of course, it always has that kind of leaf dieback where part of the leaf starts to die and the whole leaf kind of starts to die, which is just a definite indicator we have some sort of fungal or disease infection going on. So that's usually what people tend to notice first. Problem is, it tends to happen in our summer months, July, August, September, and we're used to our trees suffering during that time anyway, because we're usually more drought and it's hot. And so we do see some canopies start to fail during that time just due to lack of water. So that's how we try and get people to realize that there is a difference. Understand this new tree we're dealing with in our canopy, and understand that we need to be checking pretty much all of them for this new disease. And it's not that hard to treat, actually. Oops, sorry, popping along. It's one of those things we tend to recommend the applications in fall if you can, because we try and stick with that same treatment window of kind of, beginning of October through March. So we want to kind of stick with that. Since these do go fully dormant, it's one of those things you kind of got to get it before the leaves create all their decision layers, or you want to get them in early spring. All right, now moving on to ALLEPO blight. So ALLEPO pine blight is, well, anytime someone calls me and says, hey, I have a leaf blight, usually that tells me we don't know what's going on. And that is pretty much what we say when we say ALLEPO pine blight. We don't really know what's going on. There's been a few theories that some sort of fungal or possibly bacterial infection in the pine tree. Most of the pines that we've worked with have definitely had some sort of mite activity with the trees, but not necessarily all of them. So at this point in time, we're still trying to identify what might be going on with the ALLEPO pines. So far, we've seen it out in Vegas. Some of it's in the Arizona, Southern California. So it's kind of staying down in that more western area, southwestern area. But if you do happen to find this, we are looking for more research sites, particularly on this, especially if there's a grouping of trees, so we can do some actual trial work. But you'll see, you always tend to get the dead and dying kind of new growth. So it kind of looks like it's on the whole outside of the tree. If I was looking at an oak tree, I'd say, hey, maybe it's a twig girdler and we've got some natural pruning going on, but it's not. We don't see any sort of boring pest associated with this particular disease. So as of right now, we don't have any real answers for you other than definitely check the trees for mites. We do know there does seem to be possibly some sort of association with mites, and definitely knock the mites out as quickly as possible. I tend to recommend doing an injection of acephate for that because it does knock the pest out in 24 to 48 hours. So it's very quick. That way you can eliminate that feeding stress. But then after that, we got to identify what's really going on. So if you are in some sort of reclaimed water situation, remember Conifers do not like reclaimed water. So if you can, flush with clean water if you're dealing with that. And also take a soil sample and see what your salt levels are looking like. You may want to do a salt flush to help mitigate some of the issues for the pine trees. So like I said, no clear answers on this one at this time. Want to make sure you're aware of it. And if you do happen to have a site where you think you might have this, please reach out to me. We are always looking to do new and more research on this one. Okay, gold spotted oak borer. You guys have heard this pest for years. We've been fighting it for a while now. The reason why I bring this up on our invasives is it is an invasive. It came out of Arizona. And since we're in California, it's an invasive. Actually, amazingly enough, we get a lot of our invasive pests from Arizona. So we got our eye on them for sure. So this one came out from Arizona, and it's another flathead borer that specifically targets our oak trees. It tends to prefer our live oaks, our valley oaks, black oaks, but it's a tree killer. So if we happen to see a thinning canopy, we tend to look a little bit closer to see what might be going on. Being a flathead borer, we look for the D-shaped exit holes on the trunk of the tree associated with this pest. You can also look for the larvae inside underneath the bark. It does make galleries, so you can kind of go in there and dig and see if you can find the larvae. This one we're also doing research on. They know imidacloprid works well for it. You can do a soil drench if you have kind of a minor infestation. If the infestation is getting higher and starting to do damage, you definitely want to go up to the trunk injection of imidacloprid. And then we're working with the research on the emamectin benzoate, particularly on this pest. So we should hopefully have that information out here in the next year or so on confirming the effectiveness of emamectin benzoate on this one. So that way we'll have to do it every couple years. But yes, we are tracking this one. So if you do happen to find it, let somebody know. It's one of the only flathead borers we have in our oaks. So definitely report it. We want someone to come out, take a look, and confirm what might be going on. Okay, last but not least, invasive shotwell borer. This is one of those pests that we have talked about it so much, and it's still out there and it's still spreading. Right now it's in San Luis Obispo County, Santa Barbara County, and everywhere south of there. It's moved into the Kern County, and it's going to continue to spread. So this is one of those pests that probably should have been classified maybe as a Class A pest and put under quarantine, so we didn't ship it and move it on nursery stock because this pest prefers healthy live trees. So we didn't. So now we're kind of fighting the spread of this particular pest. It has a very wide host range. It'll attack over 300 different tree species, but it'll only actually use about 60 of them as host trees. And so they have a great ability of just having massive populations very quickly. So we tend to see a mass attacks on these trees, and there's always some sort of weeping or bleeding associated with it because it actually brings Fusarium with it. So this pest is unique in the fact that it bores into the tree but doesn't really eat the tree. It actually brings a fungal source that it then grows up inside the galleries and feeds on that while its brood is growing. So one of the reasons why this pest is so detrimental is the brothers and sisters mate inside the gallery. So when the beetles come back out, they're already impregnated and ready to go right back into that tree or surrounding trees. So this one has the ability to reproduce every 6 weeks, and it's a very fast and effective moving pest. So we should probably see it all through the West Coast at some point. It'll probably, if it spreads throughout, it'll go into Texas and all across the South as well. At this point, we don't have a natural predator for this one. We're strictly on chemical controls for it. People have been doing soil drench of imidacloprid as a preventative. If you actually have the pest, you need to bump up to trunk injection of emamectin benzoate. And you also have to treat for the fungal infection, which the cazols work for, the propiconazole, the tebuconazoles. They work well for it as treating the fungal infection. So it's one of those situations on this one. It doesn't necessarily kill all the trees it attacks, but it is a tree killer. Which ones we know it's going to kill, we don't really know. We know that sycamores, liquid ambers, and oak seem to be more susceptible than others. But we saw a bunch of willows die in the Tijuana River Valley. So it really kind of depends on what it has for a food source and how high the populations are as to how quickly trees can succumb to this particular pest. And some trees will succumb just to this disease that it's vectoring. So for instance, olive trees are very susceptible to the Fusarium that it vectors. So we might only have a few attacks on an olive tree, but the fungal infection gets in there and spreads throughout, and the tree can just die from the fungal infection. So if you can, and you have trees that you know are susceptible, which if you go to the invasive shotwell borer website, just ishb.org, it'll give you a list of trees that are very susceptible to the Fusarium. Those are the ones I would really recommend going ahead and doing proactive treatments of the propiconazole products, just for the fact that these trees can succumb, especially if it's a high value tree. A lot of our olives tend to be our high value trees out in the urban canopy. So it does behoove you to try and protect those trees from this particular infection if the pest is in your area. Okay, black diamond scale. Sorry, I'm hurrying along because I realized I got a little bit behind on my time. Sorry. So black diamond scale, this infests the California fan palm. It does not infest the Mexican fan palm. It will infest any hybrid of the California Mexican fan palm. And right now in the state of California, wow, we have a lot of hybrids. So we're really seeing this fungal infection spread throughout the state. I know, black diamond scale, bit of a misnomer in the name, but the spores look like scales, so therefore that's how it got named, and thus the reason why it's mistreated a lot with different products like imidacloprid. But it is a fungal infection that is actually very easily combated with phosphorus. One application of phosphorus, preferably in the fall, in the cooler months, is your best application. We tend to say follow it up with a nutrient boost to help really kind of push that new growth. But the nice part is you don't have to remove the old fronds. So once you protect the tree, the new fronds are going to come out clean. You don't have to go through and prune up the old fronds to get the infection out. They don't reinfest the new fronds, which is good because we don't want to pull off too many fronds on a palm tree because we can starve it from nutrients. So just leave those old infested fronds on. They'll drop down. Once they get below their 45, you can go ahead and cut them off. But a very easy pest to treat for. One that's not so easy to treat for happens to be Fusarium wilt in our palms. So Fusarium is really easily identified. Pretty much the disease wants to go down one side of the frond around the tip and then back up the other side until the entire frond is dead. There's a few out there that look a little bit similar, but on the safe side, if you can identify that you actually have this with a tissue test, it's pretty much a palm killer unless you do a lot of mitigation against it. And so we found that you can kind of suppress the disease with propiconazole and phosphorus, and then you have to kind of push nutrients to help keep it growing out of the disease. So there's a whole kind of treatment plan in that. If you watch my webinar I did on palms, it kind of goes into the whole treatment process of this. But just know this Fusarium wilt doesn't just go into the Phoenix canariensis. It will also go into our fan palms. And it dies in the same manner where the infection starts at one side and then goes across and dies. It's very kind of a unique phenomenon. And then Hodel just announced that we have a couple more Fusariums going on, ones that are getting into queen palms. So we have a distinct issue going on with Fusarium in our palms. But just keep in mind that we are able to suppress it. And since these are high value trees, it's definitely worth the while to do the suppressing of this particular disease. All right, South American palm weevil. This one is only in Southern California, but I always talk about it because this is one of those pests that's not in quarantine and can easily be shipped up to just about anywhere. Because this weevil itself feeds on the main meristem of the palm, and it feeds on the new fronds that are just starting to develop and come out. So when the fronds expand, they come out with all these notches chewed into it. And so therefore, it's pretty easy to identify. Imidacloprid works as a good soil drench preventative. If you already have the pest in the tree, you definitely want to go to the injection of imidacloprid, get it up there even faster. But once this pest eats the meristem, the main apical meristem out of the palm is dead. You've lost your growing tip. You pretty much lost a $30,000 palm. So that's why we're trying to get people to be very proactive, look for this, identify this, and it's a very easy treatment for this. But also look if you're planning on shipping or planting out a palm, because this is one of those pests that could easily get tied up into the fronds and then just shipped off and planted out in a new location. And when you open up those fronds, they're half eaten. You're like, oh, shoot. So keep that in mind on this one. He's kind of hard to miss. He's not a small pest. And like I said, he's currently in Southern California, but can easily be shipped anywhere. All right, a couple of pending invasives, and then we'll get out of here. So lethal bronzing. Lethal bronzing is not yet in California. This is also known as the Texas Venus palm decline. This is a bacterial infection, and it's unfortunately one of those things where we in California would see it and think we have Fusarium. but it doesn't have that same leaf or frond dieback going down one side and down the other. These kind of turn reddish brown, and they almost kind of want to start in like the center. It's a very unusual kind of death pattern. But that being said, we don't have it here yet, but if someone happens to know a palm declining, definitely report it. Dr. Hodel and Mark Hoddle, they're definitely people who are following what's going on with all the palms in California. They're a great resource of information, and just kind of keep an eye out for this one. All right, the palmetto weevil. This is also not in California yet. However, it is pretty much heavily infesting Florida. We do sometimes get our palms from Florida, so it's a quick trip to California for this little pest. And once again, it does that same thing where it's going to attack kind of that meristem. It's going to chew it out, and it's going to end up killing the entire canopy of the frond. So this one you're not going to really notice unless you actually catch the pest itself. The death pattern is very similar to the South American palm weevil. But as you can see, this guy's happy to go into our fan palms. So that'll probably be our first indicator that we have him, is just by the different variety of palm in which he's attacking. So right now there is a myriad of treatments they're doing out in Florida for this pest. But like I said, if you happen to see any sort of weevils in your palm trees, definitely report them, catch them if you can, put them in a container, and we will definitely wanting to be studying those. Asian longhorn beetle, this is another one that has made its way into California a couple times and on the west a couple times, but it's never established. It's always come in on like packing materials or something of that nature and has been eradicated. This guy is quite large, as you can see them next to a quarter. They're distinctive in the fact that they have white spots on their body, but what makes them even more distinctive, of course, are their long horns that have the stripes of black and white on them. There's no real lookalikes of that pest here in the West. So if you happen to see it, by all means report it. The holes and damage they do in our hardwoods are about the size of my pinky. It's massive damage. So they have a real ability to kill the trees rather quickly. There's different methodologies. I think APHIS calls out trunk injection of imidacloprid specifically for this pest. Mind you, if you find it, I think they still have the process in place where they are removing any trees that are infested first and then treating the remaining surrounding trees. And then emerald ash borer, I alluded to this guy earlier. We do not have him in California. He is another flathead borer who prefers ash trees and has done an incredible amount of damage in the East and Midwest. Right now it's about as far west as the west side of Colorado, but he will eventually get here. It's a matter of time, and it does look like he has no problem going into our Modesto and Raywood ashes we have out here. But it was interesting about the UC study and them testing our ag trees to see if he was going to want to feed on our olives and almonds and walnuts and everybody else. So the way we really identify this guy is really that canopy, that double canopy system he causes. And essentially what happens is when he gets into that vascular tissue and destroys it, the tree can't support the big main canopy, so it starts to die out and abort. But the tree is still trying to live, so it's putting on a secondary canopy of epicormic sprouts. And so you kind of get this canopy within a canopy kind of effect. And that's usually the quick first telltale sign that you might have an emerald ash borer in the ash tree. So you get up close and then you look and you see that D-shaped exit hole associated with the flathead borer. So by all means, if you see anything that looks like it might be a tree with a double canopy, go ahead, let somebody know, we'll take a look, because this is one of those pests that, though we don't have a huge ash population here on the west, it still could be a very destructive pest for us. And then of course we have the gypsy moth we're always looking for. This one is prevalent on the East Coast. I loved the satellite photos of where you can see the damage of where the gypsy moth had gone through the forest on the east. That was pretty phenomenal. We don't have as many deciduous hardwoods in our forest, so therefore we probably wouldn't see that effect here on the west, but this is a very voracious pest. So if you happen to see, egg sacs are usually one of the first identified. When we tend to see it, we would see the larvae and we would probably look at this and say, wow, it's our tussock moth. Well, it's not. It's definitely not a tussock moth. So if you happen to see these large kind of pinkish egg masses, definitely take a photo, send it off to somebody. Any of these caterpillars, if you want to identify who they are, send us a photo. We'll be happy to try and figure them out. But this is another one of those pests that we definitely track because it can do a lot of damage to our hardwoods and their canopies. And last but not least, I'm going to end with the spotted lanternfly. This is another invasive that just kind of got started in this country. It started in the East Coast, kind of Pennsylvania area, and it has started to spread pretty quickly. Problem is it's traveling fast, and it's traveling on planes, trains, and automobiles pretty much. So the one that made it into California must have made it be a truck because it landed in Davis, California, and it was alive. We'd had a lot of dead ones show up on planes, but never anyone alive, and so this was the first one. So we have not yet seen establish a population here, but this is a pest definitely to be looking for because it can do mass reproduction, and controlling it is going to be a challenge for sure. They're definitely having issues on the East Coast with it. So this one in particular, the spotted lanternfly can lay about 30 to 150 eggs by itself. And what's kind of unique about it is this red wing. But the other thing I find interesting is the fact that birds don't want to eat it. So we don't even have a really good predator. You know, normally birds and things will go after our moths, but they seem to be avoiding this one in particular. And by looking at that one end star, that kind of red frog looking one, I'd avoid that one too, honestly. But it's a very unique pest, just even in its egg mass, from the spotted exterior wings to the interior red, to the different life stages of it and the coloration. And then if you kind of wanted the timeline, this is what it's been looking like on the East Coast. It'll probably mimic something pretty close here on the West. So just keep that in mind. We tend to see the eggs kind of January through May. Kind of get the nymphs kind of, you know, April through September. And then we get the adults later, more in our fall months. So we'll see. I have a feeling here on the West, we might see a compounding life cycle where we might get more life stages and full life cycles throughout the entire year. But they are known to do mass attacks. They will be happy to go into our grapes and our other ag industries. So that is part of the reason why here on the West we are tracking them so closely. And this might be the next big, you know, glassy wing sharpshooter that we're all told about and, you know, remember for, you know, 10, 20 years later, and inspection processes and everything else we did with it. So keep that in mind. You can see how it does its mass attacks, how there's just huge populations of sucking piercing pests that will actually harm and kill the trees. So I'll finish it there. If you guys have any more information you guys want on invasive pests, here's a few websites that are quite helpful. Feel free to snap a photo of this, this slide. If not, I can send it to you as well. Just shoot me an email after. This is my contact information. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call, send a text. I'll be happy to help you in any way I can. So that's my presentation for today. Zach, do we have any questions we need to answer here at the end?